So in this video, we're going to take a look at a very interesting parable known as the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And so this is found in Luke 16, 19 through 31. So I'll go ahead and read the passage first. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will also not come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." All right, so let's see. I'll break down some of the aspects of this very interesting story. So I do call it a parable, included amongst the parables of Jesus. There are some people who think that this story is not a parable and that it is actually um, an actual event that Jesus knows about. And part of it is the fact that this is the only parable in which a person, one of the characters in the parable, has a name associated with it. But the name really is a part of the dynamic of the parable itself. And so it's the name Lazarus is derived from this Hebrew name El Azar, which means that God has helped. And so we see in the story that Lazarus is not helped by the rich man, but in the end, he is helped by God. He is provided the comfort that he needs, that he should have been given by God. And so the fact that we have a named character is not really a very significant distinguishing characteristic to say that this cannot be a parable. In all other regards, it looks just like a parable. The rich man is not named, though it is interesting that some used to think that his name was Dives. And so it was sometimes called Dives and the Rich Man, because in the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of this, opens with "a certain man was Dives." So in Latin, Dives means rich, but it doesn't mean a certain man was, giving his name. It just meant rich. But sometimes, since Lazarus is named, the rich man was also given the name Dives. The parable is directed towards the Pharisees, who were lovers of money. Now, some people, like maybe General Levine, may not be interested in where Luke has set this and tries to understand the parable, how it may have functioned when the historical Jesus actually spoke it, and then looking at how Luke may have allegorized the text or taken the parable in a different direction than what Jesus had intended. But in Luke, it is a part of this dialogue or this teaching that is going on to the Pharisees and characterizing Pharisees as lovers of money, which is a kind of polemical activity people oftentimes cast their opponents as not really being interested in the truth, but only engaged in teaching or engaged in their activities because of love of money. We find this very frequently in the New Testament. We find it in lots of other kind of ancient Jewish and Christian and Roman literature. So the Pharisees being casted or characterized as lovers of money. The parable has really two parts to it. So it is a story of reversal of fortunes. And so that's not unique. We've seen other parables that also has this reversal of fortune, where, say, the rich fool who ends up dying, thinking that he's going to be able to sit back and relax and enjoy his life, but there's a reversal that takes place there. But here we definitely see where one man doesn't have comfort, and then in the next stage of his existence, he has comfort, and where one man who enjoys comforts and is not sharing anything of his comforts with those who are immediately around him, then he doesn't get the comfort in the next stage of his existence. The rich man's request to save his brothers by miraculous intervention is an additional item. And so this is where some scholars have thought that Luke has taken a story that Jesus might have spoken, and where it probably ends somewhere around verse 26. But then 27 to 31 is having to do with the Christian understanding of Jesus' resurrection, and that that there would be people after Jesus' resurrection who would not be convinced that Jesus is who he is, because they would not listen to somebody who rises from the dead. So, but this type of resurrection is not really what I would call a resurrection. It is sending more of a spirit to as a messenger of some kind of warning. Neither is the rich man here described as wicked, as we might see in other parables of Jesus, nor is the Lazarus specifically described as particularly righteous. In fact, when a person is a beggar, we don't know why he is a beggar. Now, he does have sores, and so sometimes what happens to people, in certain situations, maybe because of bad decisions on their part. I mean, why is Lazarus having to beg? Well, we do know something about he may have a condition that requires him to beg. He may be lame. And so the question is, well, why is he lame? Well, and of course, in Jewish society, many times, not always, but many times, they saw illnesses, disease as part of an affliction upon unrighteous behavior. So you wonder then, well, Lazarus had been seen as someone who must have done something wrong, must have been disobedient to God, and that's why he is ill like he is. And the rich man must be righteous in some way, because the assumption would be, well, people who are wealthy are being blessed by God. So the observations that one might make on exterior grounds ends up finding out that our judgments about them could be wrong. You might think Lazarus is bad, but look, he's going to be comforted by God. You might think the rich man is good, but look, he is in torment. So there's a bit of a possible surprise going on there. The rich man's wealth is indicated by several factors. He is dressed in purple, which is interesting because that is the color that's oftentimes associated with nobility, is associated with the imperial house. Fine linen is, of course, very costly. And so this, you wonder, well, this person is not just your typical wealthy person. This person may have a great amount of status in the world. And so um, he's indicated that way. It says that he's feasted um, every day, sumptuously every day. He lived in luxury. So it's not just once in a while, but he's constantly able to feast. And Lazarus is going to be sits at his gate. So he has a house that's or a property or an estate that's large enough to require a gate. So also a gate maybe for his protection because he's probably quite a wealthy person, and therefore there would be robbers who would attempt to steal from him or others who might seek to do harm to him. Um, Maybe because he gets his wealth because of his association with the, the ruling powers, and maybe he might be seen as someone who's contributes to the oppression of others. So he needs a gate to protect himself. Lazarus' poverty and affliction is also stressed. He is helpless since he lays or is laid. We notice that at the gate was laid a beggar. So somehow or another, Lazarus is not able to get to the gate on his own. He is helped to get to the gate. And so probably some kind of disability is indicated here. His hunger is described. It's interesting, described in a lot of ways, like the this longing, like the prodigal son, longed for the pods from the swine that he was feeding. So too now here is Lazarus longing for the crumbs, as it were, the food that would fall from the rich man's table. So it's indicating basically a constant hunger. The dogs take advantage, of Lazarus. These dogs that are outside of the gate, uh, they come, they lick his sores, and that he's not able to defend himself from the dogs. Again, reflects something of his sad condition, his prolonged misery, and and since dogs are seen as unclean animals, generally it also reflects something of the shame. So here's a man who just lives in shame, whereas the rich man is living in honor. And there's other things as well indicating shame and honor, which may be at play in the parable. So we'll talk about that. Here is particularly is one of those. There's no mention of Lazarus receiving a burial. Um, so, you are honored at death when you have a burial. And so we see that the rich man, when he dies, he was buried. In other words, his friends, his families gave him the appropriate, the honorable send off. But with Lazarus, it just says he died. Um, we don't know what happened to Lazarus's body. Probably, if he's a beggar and if he doesn't have anybody else to take care of him, then his body is probably dumped with a bunch of other bodies, with nobody else who has to take care of individuals, and so he has a shameful end. Now, so what happens next in the story is this kind of reversal. So after they have died, verse 23, he is in Hades. Now, I do hope that your Bible translations have the word Hades in verse 23. You may want to check. Some translations will say that in hell he was in torment. And if it is in hell, I think you should make a mark or a note that the Greek word that's used here is not the word that we usually translate as hell, which is Gehenna, but it is this word Hades. Hades is the place where the dead go. Now, at this stage of many Jewish thinking, it is a temporary place until final judgment. It's not hell was thought of as the place of final condemnation. This is the place of final judgment. But Hades is where, so for in the Israelite tradition, in the Old Testament, we have this concept of a Sheol. And so Sheol is the place where the dead will go to. So when Jews were translating into Greek their scriptures, when they came across the word Sheol and they saw what it was describing, well, the Greeks had an idea, had a word for their place of the dead, and it's Hades. You might be familiar with some of the Greek mythology, where there is Hades, the god of the dead, and takes the dead to this place, which is kind of an unhappy place where the dead will go to. And that's really what Sheol is in the Old Testament. It's an unhappy place. Nobody goes there and praises God. You're basically there and you are forgotten about. In the Old Testament, the idea is to stay alive. That's the blessing. In Sheol, in the pit, there's no praise of God. There's no blessings. It's just not much of an existence that's there. But by the time of Jesus, there did develop much more complicated ideas about what would happen to the righteous and the wicked after death. And so one concept that existed was the idea that certain people would go to this place, both the righteous and the unrighteous would go to the Hadean world, but the Hadean world could be divided. And so in part of the Hadean world, you would have paradise, you would have Abraham's bosom, you would have this place of comfort for the righteous, and you have a place of torment and suffering for the unrighteous. And so this story seems to pick up on this idea of a place where the dead goes. Now we have to be careful. We don't want to press the parable and say that this is giving us, exactly what happens to the unrighteous. It is a parable. It is a story. But when Jesus tells parables, very oftentimes he's telling parables that are based off of some understanding of what is real. And so if Jesus is telling this story to his audience, he's expecting that his audience have some kind of understanding about this place as what is happening. It may not necessarily be an endorsement as, yes, this is what really does happen to people after they die, but it is picking up on the idea that this is what happens to people after they die. So in this world, then, or in this space, we find the rich man is addressing Abraham as father. This seems to be picking up something else that we find very oftentimes in Luke's gospel and in the book of Acts, that somehow or another that Jewish descendant, being connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, coming, from having that descendancy, somehow or another gives a person a special privilege or priority before God. Of course, with the covenant relationship, yes, that is true. Abraham descendants does give you a special covenant relationship. But in Luke's gospel and in Acts, in the message that is being proclaimed by early Christians, is that this needs to be nuanced. One must not think that God does not want to give a special relationship, a covenant relationship with non-Jews, non-descendants of Abraham, and that those who think that they can ignore God's future revelation given through Jesus and his resurrection simply because they are Abraham's descendants are mistaken, that God will, as it were, reaching out to non-Jews and bringing them into this relationship um, of his covenant people, um, on other factors, on accepting, as it were, this additional revelation of God's will for his covenant people that comes through Jesus. So this rich man is going to play on this idea of Jewish descendancy, and it's going to find out that ain't going to work, that God requires obedience to the covenant laws through Moses and the prophets, not just because of your bloodline, as it were. Now, while the rich man would not help Lazarus, then he wants Lazarus to relieve his suffering. So we're going to see the kind of this rich man has a problem with narcissism. He just feels that he's owed things. He's still looking Lazarus as some kind of person beneath him who should be just simply sent to take care of his plight. So he wouldn't help Lazarus, but now he wants Lazarus to help him. The rich man then asks if Lazarus can warn his brothers. So we know that this is not final judgment, because he has this kind of consciousness that his brothers are still alive, that his brothers could, be saved from his fate, and so could some kind of warning go to him. But Abraham is going to refuse this request, and he's going to emphasize another theme that we find in Luke's Gospel and in Acts, the significance of the law and the prophets. So just because people are Christians doesn't mean that the law and the prophets are done away with. It doesn't mean that they are set aside. It doesn't mean that they live now to some kind of new law where they can do what it is that they want. That ceremonial laws, sacrificial laws, all those are still, what God expects from his covenant people who are descendants of Abraham and Isaac. So anyway, we digress here a little bit, but that is still something to note, that here the message is Moses and the prophets. God has revealed already what it is that he expects out of people. And the implication is probably not helping Lazarus, not giving anything to Lazarus, then, is an indication that you have not been following Moses and the prophets, because God has been consistent and clear that helping those who are in need is something important to him. So we'll talk here about the literary text. So I always emphasize that to understand a parable, you've got to take in the literary context, not only just historical background, but the literary one, where it's set. So it is spoken inside what we call the travel narrative of Luke's Gospel, which starts at the end of Luke chapter 9 and moves all the way to Luke 18. And all of this deals with following Jesus on his way of self-sacrifice. So this is a section where he oftentimes talks about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, emphasizing self-sacrifice, since Jesus himself is going to Jerusalem to be a self-sacrifice. It follows three parables about either seeking or receiving what was lost, chapter 15, and also one about a dishonest steward in 16, 1 through 9. Now, I think that it follows this parable of the dishonest steward is very important because of what is said at the end of that parable. In that last parable, there was a teaching that states to make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous mammon, usually what is thought about as wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal habitations. That's a very interesting way for that parable to end. So now what we are seeing here is this is what really Lazarus should have done. He should have made, this is what rich man should have done. He should have made Lazarus his friend by using his wealth so that now Lazarus would be welcoming the rich man into Abraham's bosom. It also follows other teachings that are warning against serving riches rather than serving God. So it just kind of fits this pattern of interest in Luke. And we find it not only in the gospel, but you're going to see it as well displayed out in the behaviors of the disciples in the book of Acts, where this concern about wealth versus doing what it is that God wants someone to do. In the context of Jesus' ministry, it also fits. We see that Jesus teaches that the poor are blessed. Those who are actually poor are blessed because God is still looking after them and has something prepared for them. They'll experience His justice. Jesus has parables that denounce the greed of the rich. So, see the parable of the rich man and his greed in the sense of keeping his bounty rather than sharing it. And Jesus instructs disciples to sell their possessions and give alms to indicate where their heart is. So in all of this, we're seeing this this parable kind of fits what it is we would expect. So it sounds like a story one might imagine Jesus to have taught. So that is the context of this parable and some points to look at. So as we interpret it, we're probably interpreting this parable in line of as a warning to the Pharisees that they should not be lovers of money, but instead do what God requires, follow the law and the prophets, and particularly taking care of those who are vulnerable, who are needing, who are right there before them, and not to turn their hearts away from them. And so that's not only a message for Jesus to the Pharisees, that's also Luke's message to his audience, Christians. They too, as disciples, must be willing to share their possessions and would be a message for us today.